But we begin tonight with the news just happening late today. Former President Trump's lawyers have filed a court motion asking for an independent arbitrator called a special master in the Mar-a-Lago search. If appointed, a special master would review evidence in the case. In a statement announcing the motion, the former president called the search an unnecessary, unwarranted, and un-American break-in. For more on this, Robert Costa joins us now. He is CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent. Bob, former President Trump's lawyers have just filed a motion requesting the appointment of a special master. You broke this story a few days ago. Why are they requesting this?
This is weeks after the FBI searched former President Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate just across the water behind me. They went in there in early August looking for classified material that they believed former President Trump took with him in the final days of his administration from the Trump White House to his estate in Florida without going through the National Archives. And after they heard about that, they began to investigate whether former President Trump properly handled those documents, the classified material in some of those boxes, and it began this federal investigation. After the FBI search, there has been an outcry among Trump's supporters and from Trump himself, as well as his lawyers. But until now, we haven't had a clear picture about how exactly they would respond beyond anger. And today's filing is the first step they've taken in a few days, at least, to show their next legal plan on this front, which is to contest the search in some way by requesting a so-called special master. In other words, a neutral party to come in and work with the Justice Department, work with the Trump lawyers to have what they believe would be an independent arbiter to look over this material, this evidence, and possibly return it. It's going to be complicated, though, because you have a federal judge in Florida who's right now evaluating how to handle whether to release the affidavit that led to the warrant, whether to redact all or some of that affidavit. And that deadline is Thursday for the government to submit its material on that front. And so now added to this discussion is the Trump decision today to file this motion asking for a neutral party to review it all. It leads us into uncharted waters later this week about where this probe is going between the Trump lawyers and the Justice Department.
And so in terms of the judge that you just mentioned who did formally reject the government's request to keep the search affidavit fully sealed, I mean, based on that, does this mean potentially we could see some portions of this affidavit come later this week?
It's certainly possible, but Judge Bruce Reinhart here in West Palm Beach, Florida, he said in a 13-page order earlier today, which is essentially a statement of his opinion, his assessment of his view on how this is all going. He said today that he's going to listen to the government as it makes its case for redactions, and he might well side with the government in its belief that much of this affidavit, this underlying evidence, should not be made public. But he did note that he has not made a final decision on how to handle the affidavit because he stated he believes that there is a historic interest, intense public interest in having a lot of this underlying evidence be made public so people would understand why the former president's home here in Florida was searched by FBI agents. He said it's unusual circumstances that demands more answers from the government. But the government is saying repeatedly that because of sources, methods, dealing with witnesses, they don't want to say too much. And so at this point, it looks like it's going to be a battle between those who want to redact everything or most of everything and those who want it all in terms of the information about this case to be made public. We'll see where the judge ends up leaning. We won't know until about Thursday this week in that noon deadline here at the West Palm Beach courthouse.
As you alluded to earlier, this is complicated. So what is the political impact of all of this?
Complicated as well. It's hard to predict the political fallout, especially for a former president who is facing legal scrutiny, not only here in Florida, but just north in Georgia, the Fulton County grand jury investigation into Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election, the New York State Attorney General, the Manhattan District Attorney, the January 6th Committee on Capitol Hill, the Alan Weisselberg, his former CFO at the Trump Organization, now working with prosecutors in a case revolving the Trump Organization. So you see on all these different fronts, the former president dealing with legal challenges, but politically polls show him in a strong position with Republican voters. But that doesn't mean he has the 2024 nomination sewn up should he decide to run. At this point, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis remains very popular with core Republican voters, and there are some new names out there, like Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, some names we've heard before, like Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, who are all keeping an eye on the 2024 presidential race. Should Trump decide not to run, or should Trump run and somehow be hobbled politically or legally?
And as you know, there are still a lot of questions about what's in those classified documents and how they got down to Mar-a-Lago in the first place. What have you learned in your reporting about the former president's record keeping?
We've learned a lot in recent days about how this happened. How did classified documents get down to Mar-a-Lago behind me? Well, it's because the former president decided to bring them down. And the process is set up with protocol for when presidents, when they leave the White House in January after being defeated or retiring, that they have to work with the National Archives to hand over official presidential records, let the National Archives sift through them, and then they're given to the retired president, the former president, to deal with their own presidential records and presidential libraries. The former president, Donald Trump, did not go through that process with about 24 boxes that he had housed in his residence at the White House in the final days. And because he did not go through the National Archives process, federal prosecutors say some classified material from intelligence briefings ended up in those boxes that then got brought down to Mar-a-Lago and were stored in storage areas. And part of what prompted the search, we have learned today at CBS News, is that there's video surveillance that was acquired by the government after it issued a subpoena to the Trump legal team for that surveillance. And they see in their surveillance footage some people in and around and about, going into and out of the storage area inside Mar-a-Lago. Now, sources close to the Trump legal team say, don't read anything into that. It's just people who work for Trump being in the storage area. But this did concern, based on our reporting, federal investigators who worried that there might be too much access to this storage facility inside Mar-a-Lago.
Robert Costa with multiple developments for us tonight. Thanks so much from West Palm Beach, Florida.
Thank you.